And here it comes. All right. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to see all of you. I'm kind of out of practice with this group stuff in Zoom, so we used to do this all the time. But it's wonderful that you're here today, and we have a very special guest joining us. I'm going to introduce her in just a second. I want to just touch really base very quickly on protocol. I'd be very grateful if you keep your microphone muted until there's a time for a question or some kind of interactivity, just because you know how it goes. So that would help us a lot. We have, I think, about gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we have about 13 people on. So that'll help us manage the sound. And now I was very excited to introduce our guest, Rabbi Naamah Kelman, who on my screen is up in the upper left-hand corner. She is the most recently retired dean of Hebrew Union College, the campus in Jerusalem, and where she served for many years in different positions. When I said on the Bima Friday night during announcements, I said that Rabbi Kelman's a big deal. Here's why, and for many other reasons, but here's the first one. She was the first woman ordained as a rabbi in the state of Israel in 1992. Rabbi Kelman is the descendant of 10 generations of rabbis. She was born and raised in New York, and she made Aliyah in 1976, I dare say to a very different Israel than the one she lives in today. And since her arrival, she has been involved in initiating, supporting, and establishing programs, organizations promoting Israeli Reform Judaism, Jewish pluralism, feminism, and the Israeli Jewish Renaissance. She has worked extensively with Israelis and diaspora Jews to build bridges and to create joint programs. And in addition, she has been active in interfaith work and in peace work. And before I turn it over to Rabbi Kelman, just a tiny bit of just a personal privilege, I guess I'll take, is that, of course, when I was a student, I spent a year on the campus of HUC in Jerusalem. So Rabbi Kelman was my first dean. And very busy position, because in addition to the programs that prepared rabbis, educators, and cantors, or students in those areas to enter our new profession, she was also overseeing a program that was preparing Israeli Reform rabbis and other programs that happened at the campus. So a very dynamic place, and a very important role that she played. One tiny personal story: in the spring of my year in Israel, early spring, can never tell, the weather was pretty good. I got an email from Rabbi Kelman asking me if I would teach a nigun at Kol HaNeshama, which is a Reform congregation in Jerusalem, and I used it on campus that week, and she asked me if I would teach it. She was leading services that week, and I was, of course, petrified. New rabbi kind of coming up, but also this is a group of Israelis, and I was going to teach them this. They would prefer that I speak Hebrew. Most of them could speak English, but so there I was, and I survived, and it turned out great. But it was a wonderful opportunity to be with Jews in the pews in Israel, and I've always been grateful for that. And now I'm glad that I've been able to invite you to be in our space this afternoon. So with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Naamah Kelman.
So thank you so much, Rabbi Bargeron. For me, it's a special delight, because we do get our students, Rabbi Meir, when they're diamonds in the rough that first year. And of course, I look for those who are particularly glistening. And so it's really nachas to see and to have followed him all these years, especially now in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I want to wish your congregation a mazal tov on your 175th birthday, which I could say is, in a nutshell, the story of the Jewish people. We persist, we go on, we stay strong, and I'm delighted to be with you. So I am going to try and make some order in what has been chaotic, challenging, almost 8 weeks now. And so I'll start with a kind of overview, and then I'll go a kind of deeper dive into things. And I want to thank you all for joining on this rainy Indiana afternoon and taking the time to hear about Israel from the home front. And I do want to say that we recognize, and we can talk about this maybe in the Q&A, I think Israelis also have begun to recognize your vulnerability and the concern for anti-Semitism on the rise in the United States. And we recognize it not as, oh, that's, the consequences of living in the diaspora. But no, we are all in this story together, Jews worldwide. And if you take anything from our time together, I hope you feel the strength and the resilience of the Jewish people, which is the parallel story going on, in addition to the terrible massacre that led to our ground invasion and the ongoing war. So things remain very dynamic. Things are changing all the time. Urgent issues that arose in the first weeks have become less urgent. There are new issues arise, new traumas. We're constantly going through many stages of despair and hope and grief and resilience and fear and resolve. And that can be in one day sometimes or over one Shabbat. So if you're feeling this as well, yeah, that's what we're all feeling. This kind of, this very crazy combination. So needless to say, on October 7th, we started from the terrible shock of the invasion that caught everyone or many people off guard. And the horror that within days of the numbers of dead and of course hostages taken, and then the invasion, our entry into Gaza, which I don't know if you even remember, it took a good 2 weeks to amass the soldiers down in the south. And all this, again, while this is going on, constant losses, realizing the impact of the invasion. And just this week, finally, a recognition of the horrific sexual violence that went on and rape, and maybe some recognition. So even though that happened weeks ago, it's become an urgent topic of conversation. And if you were in New York, I'd urge you all to attend a rally tomorrow at 9:30 at the UN, when finally the UN Commission of Women, for what it's worth, will actually hear testimony. And I can just say I'm very proud you're a Reform Synagogue, that our very own Rabbi Mary Zamor, who's the executive director of our Women's Rabbinic Network, will be representing Jewish women. And I'm very proud that she will be there. And of course, some remarkable Israeli women as well. And again, just this past week, the brief ceasefire, while at the same time, the sadistic return of the hostages. I have no other word to use but to say another layer of trauma that we were put through. Having said that, 110 hostages have been released, and we are extremely grateful. And except for this brief ceasefire, we have had non-stop missiles flying over Israel, from the north and from the south. And sometimes I actually had a short visit to the States to visit I have children and grandchildren in the States, and it's almost shocking to me how that somehow doesn't register that we are, and because of the missiles, another crisis has been created, which is the evacuee crisis. There are close to 250,000 evacuees. People have been moved from their homes, those who are directly hit and those who are potentially hit, for example, in the north. So we are dealing with constantly these crises altogether. And I just want to say, and maybe it's obvious, this was all coming out. This began after 9 months of tremendous amount of civil unrest that was spearheaded by the so-called judicial reforms and the anti-reforms protest, of which I'm proud to say I was part of, that was gaining a lot of momentum of trying to halt what many of us felt was a terrible threat to the future of Israel's democracy. And during that time, there was this possible threat of soldiers not wanting to be called up, which of course turned out to be ridiculous. There was something like 130% IDF mobilization. Now, meaning more than who was called up. So I want to talk about the first responders, and as I said, the parallel story here, which is the story of the mobilization of civilians. And by the way, the 350,000 soldiers reserve duty are also civilians. So there's been this remarkable mobilization of forces to keep this country running in many ways. The first respondents were exactly this protest movement, morphed into the biggest civic, welfare, relief, rescue, supply, attention agencies all over Israel. It was remarkable. Within hours of the invasion, a group called Brothers in Arms were already down at the border. These were reservists who were leaders of the protest movement, who put on their uniforms way past reserved duty age and went down to the border to help soldiers get ready. And meanwhile, in the major cities and all over, Brothers in Arms and many other organizations set up what we call these relief centers. And I'll give you some examples of that. Also in the first days, of course, President Biden arrived, which was amazing, and he continues to be involved, I understand, daily, if my prime minister claims to be talking to him every single day, which makes me very relieved that President Biden is heavily involved. His trip was extraordinary when he came for Israelis, and still resonates. So, as I said, we live in these constant spirals of events that intersect, interlock, interface, and as I said, phase one was helping the soldiers get to the borders and be fully equipped. As it turns out, that the IDF really was not prepared for this massive mobilization, and the general public, the civil society supplied also, you name it, from deodorant to underwear to socks to sleeping bags to food, hot food, canned food, you name it. I was buying Tylenol for soldiers. I went to the relief center and I said, what do they need? What do they need? So they said, we don't have enough Tylenol. So, and you would literally, and I've said many times, one of the not so secret, what enabled the protest movement to pivot overnight and all of us to mobilize was, unlike Americans, we're all on WhatsApp groups. And you go into these WhatsApp telephone groups and you say, where do I bring a winter coat? And you'll get an answer within seconds. Okay? So all these protest groups flipped into connection groups to get, as I say, supplies, equipment, food, drugs, you name it, down to soldiers. And at the same time, within days, to start supplying all the above to the evacuees who are showing up to hotels all over Israel. I think Jerusalem has 30,000 evacuees from the south and mostly from the south. I'm talking about Ashkelon and Sderot, and the kibbutzim went to, from the Gaza envelope, went together to Eilat, to the Dead Sea. They went as whole communities, and Kiryat Shmona and Sderot, who are weaker communities, showed up in many hotels all over the country. And as I say, there's been incredible efforts to absorb these evacuees and to have some kind of semblance of life, which is not very easy when you're living in a hotel for 7 weeks, and you don't know when you're going home. And certainly for the kibbutzim, they don't have home. Many of the kibbutzim that were so destroyed, they don't have homes to go to at the moment. So all these intersecting crises and stages, and while while this is happening, of course, we also have to bury our dead. And whether it was the 1200, and of course, this too was a rolling process, those murdered, that included 300 soldiers, and until people were identified, weeks and weeks of burying our dead. And since the ground operation, we've lost 70 soldiers in our ground operation since we went into Gaza. And one of the WhatsApp group units that was created, which I'm part of, is rabbis of all denominations who got together. Let's say I'm in a group in Jerusalem, and we're some 35. Jerusalem has a lot of rabbis. And we get from the command center, we get names to go to visit a Shiva home, to go to a funeral. Israelis attend these funerals en masse, and they visit Shiva homes en masse. But we went there to meet with bereaved families to say, we are rabbis of all denominations. If you need spiritual support, if you need care, is there anything that we can already move ahead and help you get? Because we're connected to the command center that's sending out psychologists and social workers. So, okay. I'll show you some examples also of things you can imagine. So these rabbinic teams are not only visiting the bereaved and comforting and following up and absorbing some of this trauma. Many of our synagogues themselves have turned into centers of distributing food, clothes, and at the same time dealing with congregants who have children in the army. I'm a member of a Jerusalem synagogue, Reform Synagogue, which my brother founded, where Rabbi Meir sang so beautifully. We have over 80 soldiers in our community. And since its establishment, we say the prayer for the safety of our soldiers. But since this war began, we started to name them. And I told the rabbi, I thought we had around 50 names. He says, no, I read 80 names each time. 80 soldiers who are children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, you name it, of our synagogue, our Reform synagogue in Jerusalem. And of course, throughout this, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which of course the world is very much focused on, and also at the same time, fears of actions of Israeli Arabs, the West Bank, the northern border, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, all of a sudden decided to join. And for the most part, certainly East Jerusalem has been quiet, except for last Thursday when there was a terrible terror attack. So there was this fear at the beginning that the West Bank and East Jerusalem and even Arab villages all over Israel that where there are Israeli citizens who are Arabs might join the fight. That has not happened. That has not happened. So we're living with all this uncertainty, mourning, and while at the same time trying to get back to normal, and also at the same time asking ourselves, can we create new social contracts? What have we learned? So many of our concepts, we call it here, broke down we thought we were the best army in the world and best prepared. Well, we're not. We are now. Okay, we thought this about ourselves. We thought that about ourselves. We thought we were one big ununified country because of the protest movement, and we became in a lot of unity. Now, it's cracking in certain places, but on the whole, we found our joint resilience. And the last thing I want to add, and it's not a stage, but it's kind of again, an interlocking phase, which is world Jewry, your role since day 2, American Jews, North American Jews went into wonderful solidarity and financial support mode, which you do really well. And now we've already in the phase of solidarity missions. And now we're already in the phase of people coming to volunteer. And by the way, the latest stage of volunteering is now agriculture. Mostly foreign workers and Palestinian workers worked our fields. So now people like my husband and myself are going out to the fields to work. There's also been a massive mobilization around that. So let me now illustrate for you with some wonderful and I think very powerful slides. And then we'll have time to talk. Okay. So for those of you who read Hebrew, the October 7th was a Shabbat, was Simchat Torah in Israel, and in Reform communities. And it is now being called Shabbat Shchora, the Shabbat of darkness. But those of you who love Hebrew and love Hebrew, playing with Hebrew, roots of Hebrew can often mean one thing and its opposite. Okay? So shachor is darkness. But what word does shachor also contain? Shachar. Think shacharit. Mm-hmm. Morning prayers. So in this darkness, there holds a new dawn. I truly believe this. And that's what I want to share with you. Okay. Next slide. So I said this, but now I'll illustrate it. These are the kind of concentric circles. So who's directly affected? Those are the kibbutzim of the south that were invaded and were murdered and destroyed, and those who attended the music festival who were murdered, kidnapped, those who were directly affected, and of course their families. That's the inner circle. You could call these circles of trauma, and those are the most affected. The next circle is what I call the evacuees. I have a number there, 125,000. I think, as I said, it's closer to 250,000 evacuees who are now living in a somewhat shrunk. We've come down from the north, we've come up from the south, and Israelis are in kibbutzim, in hotels, living with families. Okay, so that's the next circle. And again, unclear when they're going back. After them are the enlisted and their families. These are the soldiers who are now on the borders. Again, over 300,000, and they've left families, wives, children, husbands, parents, grandparents, and the worry and the concern. And sometimes those who are even not enlisted, they actually active duty. I spoke to a friend recently. Her son's been active duty. She didn't hear from him for 5 weeks. Okay, so that's hard. That is really hard. Then, of course, the next circle is Israeli society at large, Jewish society, Arab society, and as I mentioned before, Arab society for the most part has remained quiet. And I can tell you as a Jerusalemite, many East Jerusalemites, because their status is different, are very afraid to come into Jerusalem. For the first weeks, those who own stalls in the open air market didn't show up. Now they do. Okay, in the Galilee, where there's much more coexistence, I think there's more trying to go back to kind of normal life. But there's a lot of tension. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, Ramla and Lud in our last little Gaza then erupted in rioting. And that hasn't happened at all. And I'm happy to say there are some voices from the Arab sector decrying the violence and the massacre that went on in the name of Islam and by Hamas. And finally, World Jewry and Israelis abroad, how they have reacted, how you have reacted. And again, you see rockets all the time, missiles all the time. And what I'm describing here will inevitably create some kind of economic slowdown. You know, when you have tens of thousands of people not living in their homes and not running their businesses and working, that could be another crisis brewing. Okay. So on October 8th, the major cartoonist of Haaretz created this cartoon, of which all the ministers of the current government, until a little emergency government was created, were all hiding under the table. And you can see Bibi Netanyahu is kind of hiding as well. And I think that's what overwhelmingly Israelis felt for days and somehow for weeks. Where is the government? Where are our leaders? They are hiding. They're not here. They're not functioning. And I could spend a lot of time telling you why this government and Netanyahu's governments over the decades have depleted social services, have given disproportionate money to the ultra-Orthodox. And that's why and also was cutting funds to the army in some way, supplying and moving a lot of resources into the West Bank, as opposed to the Gaza border, the kibbutzim, and the army that was there. So there was this terrible sense of abandonment that our government was AWOL. And because of that, and because, as I said, and those of you who know some of the characters of play, this cartoonist put little props and all sorts of symbols, but overwhelmingly, that was the sense that our government is gone. And it took a few days until finally, more than a few days, where Gantz joined the government, creating a super kind of executive war council who have more or less been running things. And that's when things began to turn. So what happens instead? Again, those of you who can read Hebrew, you see Chet Mem Lamed, which stands for Hamal, which is Cheder Milchama, the war room. Okay, but Milchama is war, and it's also Chemla, compassion. And what happens was, as I say, entire every city had, based on the protest movement and other NGOs, turned into these war rooms or compassion rooms to get supplies. So what you see here, there's an art school, a film school that turned its theater into collecting the tons of boxes of food and dry foods and supplies that went to the army. This was a secondhand store that within days was set up to supply clothes and toys and books to the evacuees, of course, for free. We got so many clothes that we had to stop after 2 weeks of the amount of, there's me folding clothes, okay, trying to put them in boxes in different places. There were thousands and thousands of volunteers. So many volunteers that in some ways they couldn't all be used. Now it's interesting, weeks later into the war, a boutique that I frequent, I noticed that they had a campaign for some support, because it turns out that particularly the evacuees, not everyone wants to wear secondhand clothes. And here are these women displaced and with no agency, and this wonderful boutique owner in Jerusalem, connected to her sister boutique owners and some big stores, and went to hotels. You see, this is a hotel in Tel Aviv, and created in the lobby boutiques where women could try on and buy brand new clothes for free and take them. And you think about, those of us involved in spiritual care and religious support, I can't think of one better act of spiritual support, of returning a person's agency to themselves in choosing their own clothes. These little things, and I could give you so many examples of the creativity of Israelis in helping one another. Just remarkable, inspiring, okay? And here was something I didn't even think of. I spent the first days of the war folding secondhand clothes, thinking how important that is. Okay, I apologize that this is in Hebrew, but look at the imagery. There's another wonderful cartoonist who, in the first days of the war, created a map of Israel, which he called the Map of Pain. And you can see the famous cry. And he has here the Bay of Anxiety, the Sea of Tears, the Valley of Fear, of Anguish, of the Wadi of also of fear and suffering. And yes, and then he had a little index here, sweat, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, paralysis. And then he said to himself, wait a minute. We live in two maps. We live in two countries. And this is his map of hope. And this is called the Map of Hope, Hatikva, where we have the Sea of Optimism, filled with waves of ahava, of love. And here we have the wells of healing, mutual care, the Hamals, which I shared with you, the volunteering, the innovations, initiatives, solidarity, helping in schoolwork, babysitting, picking fruit. I mean, all the good stuff. And you look at the index here is full heart, support, volunteering, compassion, generosity. So we live in these maps, these dual maps, the map of pain and the map of hope. So because I'm a rabbi and I tried to volunteer, and I thought, well, maybe, yes, folding clothes is helpful, but maybe I could be more helpful. And the Reform and Conservative movements began a nightly gathering at also it didn't happen immediately. It took a week or two, and the family of the hostages began to start a sit-in gathering in Tel Aviv. And first they sat in the same place that the protest movement was, but then they moved to the Museum of Tel Aviv because it's a bigger area. So into kind of the third week of this, I signed up to lead I can't exactly call it a prayer service. It was a prayer service. It was a ritual, again, a ritual of prayer and hope. I signed up, I led it with a conservative rabbi. From Sunday through Thursdays, the conservative movement organizes it, but Reform rabbis and others can participate. Friday night and Havdalah, the Reform movement organizes it because we use electricity and live music. So you can now go to Tel Aviv Sunday through Thursday at 5 o'clock. And when I went there, people were kind of hanging around. I couldn't tell who was families of hostage, who was protester. It was a little odd, I felt, and homeless people, I felt. But at 5 o'clock, Rabbi Natalie and I stood, and suddenly there were 150 people wanting to sing with us and pray with us. It was extraordinary. It was a reminder of the power of prayer and song and together. And we made it quite interactive. And we didn't do the heavy duty prayers because most Israelis, even though they speak fluent Hebrew, are not prayers like we are. In addition, I'm sure many of you have seen the table that began also of the 200 or so, empty table. In the brand new National Library, which when you come to Israel, I hope you come to visit, opposite the Knesset and the Israel Museum, a absolutely gorgeous brand new National Library, created, I think, the most astounding, I literally, my knees buckled when I went in, also a vigil for the hostages where they set up 200 seats or so. On every seat was a picture, and on every seat was a book. What book, what age-appropriate book would this child, adult, teen be reading? And in some cases, the families made recommendations. I saw a picture of a woman more or less my age, and she had a book of poetry. And someone else had a book of taking yourself on walks in Israel. And these are children's books that they put. And I don't know if you see this white, that's, the slip we used to have in library books. And in it, it said, return immediately. And this is a particularly poignant picture because these two beautiful redheaded babies have become the symbol of the agony and anguish of the hostage crisis. They have not been returned yet. Not been returned. And Kvir is 10 months. He entered at 9 months, and he's here with the simplest baby book. And his older brother, you see Ima Vani, me and my mommy. He's 4, Ariel, his older brother. And if you see this young man and this young woman, they were released last week. Okay? And these are teen books. This young man had gone to visit his girlfriend on a kibbutz, and he ended up being kidnapped. And he was just returned to his family in Jerusalem a few days ago. And when I went back 2 days ago to the library, half the seats have been removed. So, in addition to, I think I've given you a taste of the civic mobilization in so many areas of, as I said, relief, rescue, supplies, transportation, clothing, teaching art in these hotels, teaching music, doing Kabbalat Shabbat. My daughter is a rabbi up north. She now goes every Friday to do a Kabbalat Shabbat for evacuees in the hotels in Tiberias, week after week. And then she goes and leads Kabbalat Shabbat in her synagogue up north. And in addition to do this, and I know your rabbi will appreciate this, we've also created new liturgy. We've rewritten the prayer for hostages. And I want to end my formal presentation with this and read the prayer that my Rabbi Oded Mazor, wrote this past week. So Kohelet wasn't right. Kohelet is Ecclesiastes, and Yehuda Amichai is the poet laureate of Israel, and he wrote a poem called Kohelet Wasn't Right, because Kohelet said there's a time to die, and there's time to live, a time to cry, a time to laugh. And Amichai already says, you can cry, you can laugh together, and Oded did the same. So I'll read it in Hebrew, and then maybe even though we're on Zoom, I'll ask you to join me in English. Bayamim bahem kol ha'itim kosot, achad el toch re'uta, ve'en brera ela livkot ולצחוק באותן עיניים, לספוד ולרקוד גם יחד. והיסטוריה ארוכה נדחסת אל יום ושעה אחת. נבקש את הכוח להכיל, את עצמנו, הלבבות המתפקעים, לשמוח עם הזוכים לחבוק כבר היום, לעטוף את המתכנסים כמיהתם ונפשם נרעדת, לאחוז בתקווה בלי להרפות, ולהותיר מרחב של שקט לזעקה שאין לו קול. אנא, תן לנו מקום להישבר בו לרסיסים, לרוח, להבות, לבבות, לרוח להיבנות שוב מחדש. And the English, in the days when each hour collides with the next, we have no choice but to cry and to laugh with the same eyes, to mourn and to dance at the same time, and the long arc of history is compressed into one day and 1 hour. We ask for the strength to contain the intensity of our bursting hearts, to rejoice with those who will be able to embrace today, to enfold all those leaning into their longing, souls trembling, to hold on to hope without letting go, and to leave some quiet space for a silent scream. Please grant us the room to shatter into pieces and the spirit to be rebuilt anew. So that's the last thing I want to say, that I believe as Jews, together, Am Yisrael, our mandate will be, when this is over, to rebuild. And to quote an Israeli thinker and writer, Michal Govrin, we are a people who are held together and sustained by our ability to tell our stories and change our stories, but always with the same theme: choose life. Even as we mourn, we choose life. That's the story of the Jewish people. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for a very informative, but just filled with so much. So thank you. We'll have some time for questions. And while you think of your question, if you want to ask a question, you go ahead and raise your hand. I think I can see everybody. And I'll try to call on you in order. And I'll ask one question while you're thinking. Rabbi Kelman, in the beginning of your remarks, you made, paraphrase a bit, but I got the idea of what you're saying. This, considering what came before, in terms of the protests against judicial reforms, and then on a dime, that community of protesters became united and began to focus on the well-being of the state of Israel at this terrible time. I got a sense that there are glimmers of possibilities of what a future may be, having gone through that and then going through what the nation is going through now. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that you might share.
I would say that there are already some formal initiatives talking about the day after. And at the moment, their efforts that include some of the protest movement and others, they're trying to be extremely pluralistic, that include Israeli Arabs who want to be part of a new covenant, and Orthodox and liberal. And they're just beginning, I think. I mean, I could name a few names. So that's one thing. I know at least of 2 or 3 initiatives that are beginning to talk about this. There is some rumblings of certain political shifts, a kind of moderate left needs to be reborn, because the left was pretty decimated in the last elections. And I'm talking about Zionist left. And there is some effort, I know, underway to how do we reclaim a moderate, a center Zionist left, but that wants to live in peace and find the Palestinian partners to live with. So and also realign the priorities in Israel, that it's not so sectorized. So I really can't answer that. It's a wonderful question. And us as a people, and they're going to be emerging. I know also that the protest movement is agonizing what to do, because the idea that unity is so important during the war and the hostage crisis, But I also will say there is now a group of bereaved families that are emerging in a protest movement to try and oust the current government. I mean, they're protesting, they're not doing anything except holding rallies saying that this leadership must go. I'd say the Jerusalem protest movement, which is an interesting story in itself, is now going back to gatherings talking about, let's get through this. This is terrible. Let's share our pain, our hope, and let's hope for a responsible new leadership. That's the most they'll say. So these are some of the things. But let's see, I think there's some other questions. So yeah, just unmute yourself, Kathy M. You're
Hi,
still,
my name's Kathy Mayer, and I actually live in Tel Aviv.
oh,
I made Aliyah 11 years ago, December 27th, and I'm here for a little while, took a little break. And my question is, so many of us are thinking there will be a huge wave of Aliyah after the war. I want to know your thoughts on that.
well, I think if anything will be there might be a huge wave of volunteers, like post 67, that might happen. Maybe young people. If we're wise, some of the frustration from our universities and campus, we might turn that positively into waves of volunteerism and not just picking fruit, even though I did that at, 17 also. Now I'm doing it 60 years, 50 years later. So anyway, will there be Aliyah? That's an interesting question, and I would throw it back to you. I mean, if the elections in America in 2024 take a scary direction, would that mean that American Jews might find themselves moving here? I've always said, regardless of war, if 150,000 liberal American Jews made Aliyah, Israel would change overnight.
Oh.
Do you agree as a Tel
Yes,
Avivian?
I can't thank you enough, Rabbi. And listen, I found myself going at 60 years old, never planned, on my own. And I'm so grateful, even during this horrific time. And I will say that being in the United States for me I've realized I'm more Israeli since the war. That's it. It's amazing.
Mhm.
The power of the land of Israel and the people of Israel, even when they try to run you off the road. Okay, I'm going on mute.
But then they'll take you to the hospital once they run you over.
Thank you, Kathy. Fran.
Rabbi, thank you for your very interesting presentation. You mentioned that when you were visiting in the States, you were dismayed at how the news was being reported. And this bothers me every day. And just yesterday morning, I had heard that the truce was over because Hamas had resumed firing rockets and Israel responded. And the headline in the front page headline in the paper in Fort Wayne, an Associated Press story, was "Truce Ends, Israelis Hammer Hamas." And the subhead, "Airstrikes Hit Gaza, Militants Fire Rockets." When my understanding is it was the other way around, but that's the way things keep getting reported. And along the same lines, when the horrific attack happened on October 7th, I thought the world can't help but be horrified. And that lasted about 30 seconds till Israel began the war. And now I hear on the radio a Palestinian saying, well, this is the case since Israel attacked Gaza. And I mean, it's so distorted. But part of it, I think, is that Israel constantly loses the propaganda war. And I remember hearing years ago that Israel didn't care about public opinion. It would do what it needed to do to maintain its security. And does that attitude still remain, or do Israelis understand how important it is to have global public opinion on your side? And do you think that Israel could do a better job of attaining that?
Yeah. No, Israel does care. Israelis care. Having said that, sometimes we will do what we have to do. And the wonderful comments, Bill Maher said, when Hamas attacks, it's war. When Israel responds, it's war crimes. I thought that was an interesting take. Now, we are doing terrible things, and we are killing thousands of Palestinians. That's the truth, okay? That's the terrible truth. And it just, when we're sending a mighty Air Force in, it's hard to, unfortunately, that is the price of war. It's very hard to explain to people that's, I know it sounds crazy, but and by the way, when people say to us, well, ceasefire, I'd love a ceasefire, but the other side broke the ceasefire on October 7th. I mean, they have broken every ceasefire. Now, we do respond because we do have a much mightier military, and they are embedded in civilian, and, it's a tragedy. The people suffering most are the Palestinian people. By the way, the Egyptians don't want them. The Jordanians don't want them. I mean, think of the Ukrainian war, where Europe opened its arms to all these upper middle class Ukrainians coming and flooding. No one wants, unfortunately. It's terrible. So we're doing tough things that to someone who doesn't understand the complexity it is. I wish we didn't have to do this. I mourn every innocent victim, but we're in existential crisis at the moment. We have to try and protect ourselves, and it sounds crazy. I would hope that, out of this, the only way there's going to be any resolution is that we're going to have to live side by side. We can't just live by the sword. Also, I will say this, I think there's real concern in Israel, as I'm sure by you, as we say, for the younger generation who don't understand. For them, their whole reality is growing up with Bibi Netanyahu, and the emphasis on, the settlements, and doing everything to dismantle a two-state solution, and capitulating to the ultra-right, and having the most fascistic, messianic government ever. Liberal Jews, rightly so, should be frustrated with this. And we can, and I was also with the States twice in this, also before the war. I began to feel when I was there in September that American Jews were beginning to understand, that they should get involved in the fight for democracy, because American Jews over, anything internal, we don't get involved with. But I think now it's clear we want your involvement in internal matters too, because they affect the entire Jewish people. Now, having said all that, and you and I are a generation that don't have a clue to what's really going on in social media, whether it's X, whether it's, X tweet, TikTok, there's a huge media war going on where, I don't know if we're losing, we're winning, it depends on which celebrity. I mean, there's a huge, and here many young Israelis are really doing incredibly imaginative stuff. PR firms, ad firms, to win our side, at least get our side out in social media. And that's a whole different, reality that most of us don't really know what's going on. I mean, it's true. I open the New York Times every time, and it's a picture of Gaza being bombed. That's easier to show than, and no one wants to see the horrific damage. So we definitely have a PR challenge. I don't know if you followed, Israelis despise the BBC of England. They think the BBC is actually anti-Semitic, and they've already done parodies on our comedy shows about how bad the BBC is. So that we do care. We definitely do care. And it's very hard to win this PR. We have to ask ourselves some tough questions also. How is it possible that we let our universities turn into places where you can no longer have a discussion, a civil discussion, where Jews feel unsafe? And a situation where Republicans are blaming Democrats for creating unsafe spaces for Jews in America today. I mean, can anyone explain this? You explain it to me.
Thank you, Fran. We have a question from Ronnie, and then we'll get Barbara, and then Mike. Ronnie, Barbara, Mike.
Rabbi, thank you for your presentation. I read the English language Israeli press and hear from family in Israel that the reason this was able to happen on October 7th is that that border was unguarded.
Correct.
Because all those soldiers were up in the north guarding the ultra-Orthodox who were trying to establish illegal settlements.
No, they were guarding, they were in the West Bank, guarding the religious Zionists who've become messianic fascists.
Right. And
They're
then
not ultra-Orthodox.
somebody approved a rock festival within a few miles of an unguarded border, and that there was news that somebody in the government knew this was coming. So this all seems to be factual. There's been enough evidence. My question is, what do Israelis say about all this? I mean, if those were my sons and daughters, I would be very, very angry.
Yes, so certainly the left and anyone from Benny Gantz to the left say exactly, you knew, you moved an entire battalion to the West Bank, and now it's coming out that all these women soldiers who are scouts, these kind of watching the border, they had reported for months these exercises, and because they're women, no one took them seriously. Okay, the and supposedly there were reports that got to the highest ranks, and no one believed that Hamas was capable of doing this. Yes, they were doing the exercises, but they thought their high-tech fences were enough to protect themselves. So I think a lot of Israelis are angry. Those who support the current government feel that, the West Bank has a right to be protected. But yes, most people are angry. And let me tell you something, these lovely kids who attended this party came from all different political backgrounds. And I hope when there's a next election, they will vote, these families, and say, we want a different kind of responsible government. So yeah, there is a lot of anger. It hasn't yet, the polls say, if you can believe the polls, that this current government would not be reelected. That there's a shift. I don't think there's going to be a huge shift to the left. There's going to be a shift to the middle. And another piece of anger, which you're absolutely right, is that while this war is going on, the government is giving billions to the ultra-Orthodox, funding their schools, and well, they should be funding the southern border, rebuilding the southern border, and replenishing the IDF. So there's a lot of anger about that too.
Thank you, Ronnie.
But until the coalition breaks up, there's nothing we can do at the moment, except volunteer, protest, begin to create the kind of civil society that we want to see, which is what we're doing. Someone asked about what's it going to look like. Part of this civil mobilization is saying, this is what we want to look like: unified, together, caring, not divided. You tried to divide us for 9 months. We will not be divided.
Barbara's next. Do you want to mute and ask your question?
Sure.
Actually, Ronnie's question kind of piggybacked with mine, and the answer came, so I'm good. Thank you.
Right, Mike, and then I'll get you, Maureen. Mike, do you want to have a question?
Rabbi, I'm Mike Rush, and thank you for enlightening us on what's going on over there. We appreciate it. One of your remarks referred to the judiciary thing that's going on. I take that personally. I was a member of the Indiana judiciary for 30 years. And what is concerning me is the parallels between Nazi Germany, and the courts actually allowed the anti-Semitic laws. I don't think they're bending over backwards to do that now in Israel, but have the protests worked? do you see any chinks in the concepts that they're trying to give more power to the, shall we say, the executive, if you will,
Right.
and take it away from the courts?
Yeah, I think there was some success in the protest movement. We did stop a few. The courts are not working. I'm not quite sure why exactly, because the big appeal against one of the laws they did pass, the reasonableness law, that gave the executive a lot of power, that they're allowed to make laws as long as they're reasonable, and that did pass. They did manage to pass that because their claim is that the courts had way too much control and not allowing, the military to do things. I mean, I'm much more left leaning. I thought the courts didn't do enough to stop some of the right wing actions, but okay. And it was appealed, and there was supposed to be a court response like October 15th, but we all know what happened on October 7th. So once the war started, Netanyahu declared, the reforms are on hold anyway, which he began to say, but everything's now kind of on hold. I mean, I think if he tries to pull some again, if he tries to block an election, there will be a massive uprising in the streets. I have no doubt about that. Because part of it fueled by the anger now of these families, of these, the bereaved families and the hostage families. So it won't be a civil war. We don't get that far here, but there will be a mass. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Maureen.
Thank you, Rabbi. And we've spent some time talking or visualizing what the aftermath may be in government circles in Israel. Can you speculate at all about Gaza?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Israel pulled out of Gaza 15 years ago, and Hamas took over. Hamas took all the billions and billions of dollars in humanitarian aid and poured it into the tunnels and poured it into missiles and poured it into killing off their enemies. And I think it will take a kind of Marshall Plan of different forces, NATO-like, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, who knows, to be in there, possibly to reestablish what could happen. And that's what I wish for. Will it happen? Unfortunately, peace activists are not exactly speaking out loud in Gaza at the moment. They fear for their lives. And all we see is the joy of bringing, dead Israelis in, and the horrific escort out of the hostages. It's not very promising when you look back there, but I hope we can reach some new arrangement. I'm not a political analyst enough. I'm a country preacher, simple country preacher.
Thanks for your question, Maureen. We have time for one more question if anyone has. All right, go ahead, Christine. Please unmute, Christine.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I had to miss just the very first part, but I want to go back to the propaganda issue because it's really influencing how the top members of our government are responding. Like I'm watching what's going on as you're talking, and Kamala Harris just came out and said, Israel has a right to protect itself, but we're really concerned that they can't continue to murder so many Palestinian civilians. So when I hear those kind of words, I feel like we're losing this. And so I'm trying to respond to it with sharing Stand With Us and some other, just cut and pasting those on as I take on people on social media. I'm really concerned too about NPR and Reuters and Associated Press, who were supposed to be neutral and really aren't. You know, the way they put pictures in and how they'll phrase headlines and clickbait. And we know that's for the sensationalism and to feed into that. And people who don't understand, I want to call it the Aboriginal aspect of Jews in Israel. We are the indigenous people. For millennia, they won't go back that far. Many will go back to the Balfour Declaration and then they stop. And so, do you have any wise words for those of us that Rabbi Kopnick, who was one of our rabbis, I shared with him one time, I don't know what to do, why I can't influence the whole world. And he said, just take care of your corner. And if we all take care of our corner, then things will go well. So my corner is taking on a couple, 3 people every day on social media and going, what did you think Israel was going to do when Hamas came in and murdered and tortured, beaten, raped, and beheaded people and sent the pictures home to mom? What did you think was going to happen? You know, just putting that out there. Do you have any clickbait wise words we might use when we know people are listening to our president, our vice president? Adam Schiff actually came out with a wonderful speech to the House that kind of reaffirmed what's going on as far as Israelis are concerned. But do you have any quick things? Because I really feel like we're losing here in the United States, and I'm very concerned to the point I lose sleep over this sometimes. So what you're thinking about what we might say that really nails it quickly, so that we're not reading extended paragraphs.
Well, I'll just answer, because in some ways I really trust you folks, you know, to take on 1, 2, and 3. And part of it is just being who we are and being proud as Jews and saying we have a long history of this. And many of you, you know, can't tolerate the fact that Jews finally have power. And, you know, as I said, they make war, we make war crimes, you know, They have war crimes and war, and we have war crimes and war. Yes, it's not, I think you shouldn't deny that we're doing hard things. That's the nature of war. I think what surprises me is that people don't realize that the missiles haven't stopped, that there are, as I said, over 200,000 evacuees who have left their homes within our own country. That these are multiple crises. What do you want us to do? They need to cease fire. They need to stop sending missiles back. What do they want? When they see from the river to the sea, what are we supposed to do? Disappear? You know, what river, what sea? By the way, that's one thing, you know, clickbait people say, what river are you talking about? What sea are you talking about? And this is a complicated issue. And I think we just have to say the Jewish people have a right to a national state, a country with safe borders. What are you going to do to secure our borders? What are you going to do to make sure that Israel feels secure enough that it doesn't have to defend itself, you know, year after year? And there are plenty of Jews, among you included. We want to live in peace with our neighbors. We want to have a Palestinian state that's safe. And okay, we recognize, but they, you know, I say two things. Are we talking about 1948 or 1967? If it's 1967, there's something to talk about. If it's 1948, there's nothing to talk about. You said the Balfour Declaration, that gives us much more time here. There's now something running around the media that says, you know, in a few days, billions of people are going to celebrate the birth, you know, of a Jew, in an indigenous Jew, who most people think no one was here until 1948. You know, where was Jesus? What was Jesus? He was a Jew. You know, so that's the lighter answer, you know. I don't know if it's helpful, and I think it's not simple, it's painful, but as I said from the very beginning, you know, who could have imagined that a Jewish community is thriving in Fort Wayne, Indiana for 175 years? Okay, that gives me hope, you know, your commitment, and that's our story. We ain't going nowhere.
Thank
bet.
you, Rabbi Kelman, for just a very informative and uplifting and hopeful description of what you're experiencing, and that means so much to us here, trying to understand things from such a distance. As we wrap up, I just want to mention just a couple of things. First off, this is coming from me. This is not coming from Rabbi Kelman. There is a very interesting speech that was given on the floor of the Senate this week by Senate Leader Chuck Schumer, a major speech on anti-Semitism, and I encourage you to look that up. It's also on video. It's about 40 minutes. So, but very, very important. And so I just want to bring that to your attention. Secondly, we will have another event in this Inside Israel series, which is what it's turning into. Kathy Mayer, who's with us this afternoon, will be talking to us on Tuesday, the 12th at 7 p.m. on Zoom about her experiences in Israel, and that's like a whole 10 days from now. So we'll probably have a lot more to talk about. And so I encourage you to put that on your calendar. You'll see the link in our emails. And lastly, at 4:30 today, so in 18 minutes, there will be a group assembling the fourth session of Kehila Kadosha, us coming together to talk about how we're feeling, how we're doing in this situation. So that will be taking place at 4:30. Email me if you need the link. Otherwise, it went out in the email. And with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Rabbi Naamah Kelman.
And
So
thank
grateful to
you.
have you with us.
You're lucky to have your wonderful rabbi. I protect rabbis, so treat him well. And
Thank you. All right.
and we can almost say Happy Hanukkah because we start this week. Remember my first slide. There's always a dawn, even in the darkness.
And be safe, Rabbi, be
Thank
safe.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Everyone.